one thing I wanted to mention is Green Fair has gotten some publicity. There's a Lebanese food truck that has awesome falafels. If you get a chance, show them a little bit of love. They're parked a little bit away, so if you get a chance to stop by there, take a look. Pat had their falafels and said they were awesome. So our next speaker is Damien Mander, who I had the opportunity to host at Green Fair about 6 months ago, and he's an amazing man. Has anybody seen his either his TED Talk or the BBC? Show hands. So he's actually from Australia, and he's done 12 tours in Iraq. And when the war ended, he went back to Australia and found that there wasn't a really good market for sniper skills in the civilian population. And so he decided to look for opportunities that might take advantage of his skills. And he ended up in Zimbabwe, where he's been working with he started the organization, the International Anti-Poaching Foundation, that protects rhinos and elephants. And it's, I think it's one of those amazing organizations. You look at people that have stepped into this space, and it's work that we all hear about, but it's fantastic to meet somebody that's come from Africa to show the Veg Fest how it's done, and his journey. He's got some amazing TED Talks. If you haven't heard his TED Talks, he talks about his journey from being a sniper to being a plant-based vegan. Probably one of the largest vegans that I've ever met. And please give a warm welcome to Damien Mander.
Yeah, thanks very much, Green. Thank you, Veg Fest, for having me here, and Green from Green Fair for doing an awesome job pulling all this together. Today I'm going to talk about a very special group of women. The reason I'm going to talk about it because I saw everyone's hand go up before when the dude asked who's plant-based here. Nearly everyone here gets it, okay? So speaking to a captive audience. What we need is the people that try and come up with excuses saying it's too hard to be able to give them an example. Now we have a group of women that I'm going to talk about here who live in what the World Bank considers one of the toughest countries on the planet to do business, Zimbabwe. They live in a rural area, and they're out there every single day on the front lines of the World Wildlife War protecting one of the largest elephant populations left on Earth. And they're all vegan. They're all 100% plant-based, living out there away from their families in a remote, tough, dangerous environment. So if they can do it, I'm pretty sure anyone can. So my background, I was a Navy clearance diver in Australia. That's our version of your SEALs. September 11 changed the world for a lot of people, changed the world for me as well. The Australian government formed what they termed the first and last resort for a terrorist attack on our home soil. And for the first time in the history of our defence forces, direct entry into special forces was open to the entire nation. At the end of all the selection programs that were done, there were 50 men left, and those men formed the Tactical Assault Group. Me coming from a naval background, went across into water platoon. I'd been there for 2 days and was told I was going to do the only job in our defence force that you can't ask to do. You're told you're doing it, and that was to become a special operations sniper. Deployed in 2005 for what would be the first of 12 tours for me into Iraq. The 12 times I got in an aeroplane, went back over there into Iraq, leaving my family behind back in Australia. Now, for a lot of us guys, and this, I don't want to take anything away from the real victims here. They're the victims of Iraq, the people who had their country flattened, their country destroyed. But for a lot of us guys and women that go over and work and fight in these types of environment, the real war doesn't actually start until the bullets stop. And you've got to figure out how to come back home and reintegrate back into society. You come from for me, coming from a brotherhood, a team of, a small unit team of men that cared about my life more than I cared about it myself. And I knew, we were surrounded by such a tight-knit group of people. And we had what I think is one of the most elusive things in life, and that's purpose. And then all of a sudden the purpose is gone, the network around you is gone, and you're out there by yourself and you're trying to figure out the what next in life. There's no jobs for a sniper in the local newspaper when you get back home. I do cash jobs still, if anyone's interested, we can talk later. But no, it can be quite a lonely experience. And for here in America, we got 22 US veterans a day that commit suicide because they can't figure out how to reintegrate back into society. They can't figure out what purpose is after the military. Excuse me. For me, I ended up in South America on a bit of a downward spiral, a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol. I'd heard about anti-poaching about a decade before and decided that might be worth a shot at having a look at. I'm one of the lucky ones, hey. When I hit rock bottom, I bounced. A lot of people go through the floor and we never see or hear of them again. I bought a one-way ticket to Africa, landed in South Africa. I literally didn't even have a check-in bag. I had a carry-on bag and my boots, and started touring around the continent, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe. I started to get a feel for what was going on. Now, I didn't join the military to serve my country. I did it because it was a cool adventure. I didn't go to Iraq to help the Iraqi people or to help the situation there. I went there to make money, and as a private contractor, I made a shitload of money. Now, I didn't go to Africa looking for a cause. I went looking for a fight. And up until the point in me arriving in Africa, everything about my life was kind of selfish. Everything I was doing was about me. But there was a group of people there that made me realise the important things in life are not things, they're actions. There's a group of people that leaves their family behind for up to 11 months of the year, out there on the front lines of these wildlife wars, protecting nature, risking their own life in the process. I just come from Iraq, where anything that goes wrong, we push a couple of red buttons and we got Apache gunships and special forces coming to get us out of trouble. We got any resource we want. We're operating within a $600 billion a year annual defence budget. We're looking after resources in the ground and dotted lines on the map. And I'm over here in Africa and Zimbabwe hanging out with these rangers, and they didn't have anything. And they're looking after the heart and lungs of the planet. So something was wrong there. I saw that. It's very rare to be genuinely inspired in today's world, and rangers inspired me. They made me want to reflect on who I was as a person and how I could change to something better, something that I wanted to aspire to head towards, something that wasn't about me. It was about giving, not taking. The second thing I saw, and the reason I'm here today, is about animals. I don't know, a dozen tours to Iraq or help you see the world through a different lens. I used to be a hunter, the worst kind of hunter, the one that did it for food, not even for fun. But after a dozen tours in Iraq, you start to see things a little bit differently. I don't know what it was. I grew up not caring about the environment, not caring about animals. For me, a conservationist was just a hippie that pisses off large corporations, some dude with dreadlocks. But over there, but seeing what was happening to animals don't want a car, they don't want a paycheck, they don't want a bigger house. Animals don't have one thing that we humans have that destroys us. They don't have greed. They don't have greed. Animals want one thing. They want to live. That's all they want to live. And we as a species, we continually take that away from them. The language of animals is too complex for us to understand, but the language of suffering is universal. And we can't change that. We can suppress that, but we can't change it. And I wanted to do something about it. I had two things in this world. I had money. I did reasonably well through residential property during the property boom in Australia, and I had a shitty set of skills. And I'm trained to shoot someone in the face when they're not looking from a long distance away. So I wanted to put all the skills and all the money I had to try and do something constructive for the problem I saw. And in 2009, I liquidated a property portfolio and I put 100% of what I had into starting the International Anti-Poaching Foundation. A decade later, we have the likes of Dr. Jane Goodall, who heads up our advisory board. She's our patron. We have supported rangers that currently help protect over 6 million acres of wilderness throughout southern and east Africa. We're running 3 of our own major campaigns and have run over 45 other campaigns over the last decade. But when I got started in this program, in this organisation, the International Anti-Poaching Foundation, when I started this, we went out there from day one with a very militarised mindset in what we do. Okay, now I'd come from Iraq. One of the roles that I had in Iraq was as project manager for the Iraq Special Police Training Academy. So we would recruit people from around the country, form a battalion-sized group, send it out to help stabilise an area. It did exactly the opposite, caused a mini conflict or mini war everywhere we sent these battalions. But I learned a lot of lessons from that. But the tactics I took into starting this organisation and putting out on the front lines of conservation were very similar. They were very militant. We'd go out there, and be the last line of defense for animals using force. We started off training rangers. We started protecting elephants that were being targeted by paramilitary style units crossing international boundaries and feeding their money into organised crime networks. Crime networks that see elephant ivory and rhino horn as another currency to fuel terrorism, to fuel organised crime. Alongside drugs, guns and human trafficking, it's one of the largest criminal industries that we have in the world, and some very shady characters and tactics that get used to take out these animals to get their body parts. 2015, we took everything we'd learned to date and we were given a task of protecting the eastern boundary of Kruger National Park. Now, Kruger National Park sits in South Africa, but it borders Mozambique. Now, a third of the world's remaining rhinoceros, they live in Kruger National Park, and most of those rhinos are in the southern quarter of the park. It's a long, skinny park running along the border. Most of those rhinos are down the bottom. Now, in 2015, Kruger National Park was accounting for 70% of all rhinos that were being killed globally each year. Now, most of the people that were doing that poaching were coming across the border into Kruger National Park, killing the rhino, and then heading back into Mozambique with something which weighs, a rhino horn can weigh 20 pounds, and every one of those pounds is worth $35,000 US. So these things should be locked in safes, not running around in areas the size of small countries. We went in there in the middle of June 2015, and we set up a ground level offensive against what we saw as the threat was the local community, the local population. And here we had the highest concentration, the biggest population of rhino in the world, and across the border we had the biggest concentration of rhino poaching syndicates in the world, and there were we in the middle, the most critical piece of land on the planet for rhino conservation. We set up our operation with 165 personnel, 4 different government departments. We had helicopters, aeroplanes, canine tracking units, bigger fences and more guns. And we stopped rhino poachers from coming into Southern Kruger National Park. By the end of 2016, an international downturn had been announced in rhino poaching for the first time in a decade. A collective of efforts from the Mozambique side of the border and from the South African side of the border. We got a lot of kudos, we got a lot of credit, we got a lot of pats on the back. Deep down, I knew what we were doing was not the answer. Wasn't the answer. I didn't know what the answer was, actually. I used to get up and do talks, and the first thing I would say is, we don't know what the answer is. Our job is to buy time. Our job is to be like the paramedics of conservation, to try and get this thing onto the operating table so we can buy time for better solutions, whatever they may be. 2016, started to really reflect on where this program was going. We eventually handed it over to local stakeholders that we trained up. We had been spending $1 million a year on this program, which helped play a major role in driving an international downturn in rhino poaching. We won the battle, we weren't winning the war. It's going to be 2 billion people on the African continent by 2040. 2 billion people, and those people living near and around nature preserves will decide the future of conservation on that continent, not bigger fences and more guns. Around all this time, we're reading about an overwhelming body of evidence that's telling us empowering women is the single greatest force for positive change in the world today. Now, just to put that in context of who I am and the organisation we will run, I come from special operations. It's the ultimate boys' club. You can be the president of a country and be a woman, but you can't be special operations. I have built a career across 3 continents by bringing fairly hardened men to the point of breaking and then rebuilding them into what we needed on the front lines, and women never featured, not once, not ever in that equation. So to start seeing all this evidence and reading all this information about other industries that are progressing by getting women into the ranks, women into management positions, more women on boards and doing better at their job, it made us look at the conservation industry, an industry where women are outnumbered on the front lines by 100 to 1. An industry whose primary role is to protect, and we were keeping out the greatest protectors that there are. We're keeping them at bay. Mostly due to ego, actually. Same reason as Special Forces. I remember being back in Special Forces. We had a study done on us with the interest of bringing women into the ranks. We chose to make our own selection standards harder rather than try and succumb to this women's movement. So that's the sort of mindset that we came through the ranks with. That's who we are. And that was purely ego. failing or not allowing us to see one of the greatest forces in nature. The final straw for us in giving this program a trial that we're going to talk about today was 2017. I read an article in the New York Times about the US Army Rangers putting women through their ranks and deploying them onto the front lines. Now, that may have not meant anything, except 10 years earlier in northern Baghdad, we were on a routine mission getting from A to B, and we were blown up. Our convoy was blown up, 2 people were killed, and our convoy was quickly surrounded. Now, despite always being told you're the best in Special Forces, that day we were second best, and that's not where you want to be in a gunfight. I had a 4x4 vehicle move up next to me, and I had a Dushka anti-aircraft gun pointed at my head. Now, we do have these 2 little red buttons in the vehicle, the deep ship buttons, and you push those and it scrambles a message through the reconstruction on resources. So within 2 minutes we had Apache gunships. Within 5 minutes the US Army Rangers came and pulled us out and got us back to a local base. Now, if it wasn't for the US Army Rangers coming in and getting us out, I wouldn't be here telling that story today. So if the unit that saved our life was now putting women through the ranks and deploying them onto the front lines as Rangers, as Army Rangers, then maybe there's a spot for women Rangers on the front lines of the wildlife wars. We set about to try and do this trial program in August 2017. We got closed doors from many places. Nobody wanted to give this a trial. Even an area that we had managed for 8 years and had not lost a single animal, we proposed that we start off with a team of 4 women that would patrol by themselves and be their own unit, and that was declined. We eventually found an abandoned trophy hunting reserve. Now, trophy hunting is the industry where people get on a plane, often from America, from Russia, from China, from Italy, from Germany. They fly across to Africa and they shoot a big animal, like an elephant, a buffalo, a lion. They bring it back here and they hang it above the fireplace. That's trophy hunting, different from poaching. Trophy hunting is a dying industry. You've got reduced wildlife populations. You've got shifting policy surrounding the export of products like ivory from places like Zim to countries like America, make it harder to get their trophy out. And then you've got a generation that's been raised on social media. Funnily enough, doesn't want to get on a plane and fly across the world to shoot something in the face anymore. But collectively across Africa, the trophy hunting areas make up a piece of land the size of Texas. Now, these are pristine wilderness areas that have equal biodiversity importance to national parks, but greater strategic importance, because they surround national parks and they border the communities and they act as the voice piece to these communities on behalf of entire and very complex ecosystems. Now, these areas are being left vacant with the downturn of trophy hunting. I don't like trophy hunting. What I hate more than trophy hunting is that we as an international community have relied on that as the only economic model for so many decades to protect these areas and pay for conservation, pay for anti-poaching units, pay for management. So with the West being largely responsible for driving a downturn in trophy hunting through activism, one of the things that I'm doing now is going around, just been in Europe, in Asia, going around America now, and talking about alternative models for conservation in these areas where we don't have to rely on trophy hunting. We found one of these abandoned trophy hunting reserves, and we went in and we spoke to the local chief and the local council, the local community. Trophy hunting areas are generally owned by the local community, and they lease these areas out as a way to generate an income. When that income is not there, they move in, they cut down the trees, they kill the animals for meat. It gets turned into an area for cattle grazing and mining, and that area is lost. It's lost for good. And we as a civilization, as a generation, our future as a species is directly intertwined with our willingness to preserve biodiversity. We cannot afford to continue losing such massive tracts of land. It's not about elephants, it's not about rhinos, it's about the birds, the bees, the flowers, the trees, how they all interact. This rich tapestry of biodiversity on Earth which we are destroying, and the areas where we can allow this biodiversity to flourish are being taken away. We need to find alternative models. Historically, with anti-poaching units, what we would do is we would bring in men from around the country and form that unit to protect an area from which the local population at some point in history has been forcibly ejected from, to create a national park, to create a wildlife preserve. Now, the reason we do that is that we don't want those men to be influenced by the local population that they grew up with. Corruption. Zimbabwe sits 165 out of 180 countries on the Global Corruption Index. If you can go in and remove corruption from any equation, you're already halfway home. So this is our way of removing corruption from the equation in our anti-poaching units. The problem is, the biggest line items in our budget is law enforcement salaries. So we're now dispersing law enforcement salaries around the country. The biggest line item in our budget is getting spread around the country, not coming back into the local community. So with this option, with this new model, we wanted to try and just give a trial for training women and see how they go. For me, it just came down to the selection period. Normally with men, we would do a 24-hour selection, and then they would go on to start the 3-month training program. But with women, we were going to do 72 hours. We were an organisation that had beaten this militarised drum the loudest for the previous decade. And we were being told that we're putting ourselves at reputational risk by proposing to start and lead this all-female anti-poaching unit. The chief said no. A very patriarchal society that we're living in there. The chief said no, and we begged and pleaded, said, look, just give us 72 hours. 72 hours to try and prove to you that this either can work or we're wasting everyone's time. 72 hours. So we were granted 72 hours only. And we put word out into the local communities, and we were going to give an opportunity to women that were the most marginalised in these communities to come down and try out for this program. They were survivors of serious sexual assault, domestic violence, AIDS orphans, single mothers, and abandoned wives. And they came down and they were ridiculed by the men in their communities on their way to selection. They were ridiculed and told to go back home, that they didn't belong here, and that this was a man's job. We started selection the next day. We had 37 women. So we did pre-selection interview process. We then started with 37 women. Now, I'd done selection in 2012 for 189 men. 189 men. By the end of day one, we had 3 left. Okay. By the end of day 3 with these women, only 3 had pulled off voluntarily. We knew we had something very special, and the responsibility shifted from those women in proving to us that they were capable of the job. The responsibility shifted to us, proving to them that we're worthy of training them. 20 months later, the women have just made their 100th arrest. They've been breaking open ivory and rhino horn poaching syndicates. They've all but stopped elephant poaching in the southern section of the Lower Zambezi ecosystem where they work. An ecosystem which had lost 40% of its elephants in the previous 16 years before they arrived. An ecosystem that still has 11,000 elephants and many other species and animals and sentient beings that are very worthwhile in saving. One thing we've seen with the women, observed with the women, and half of the crowd that I'm talking here today already know exactly what I'm talking about and everything. So the other half, we treat this as a bit of educational, but all the stuff I say, it has come as a surprise for us. We didn't know this. We'd never given it a chance. We'd never opened our eyes to see it. But one of the key things we've seen, observed with the women, is we haven't seen one incidence of corruption. Not one incidence of corruption in 20 months. Okay, so that removes corruption from our equation. It means we don't have to employ from around the country. We're employing 100% from the local community. All the goods and services that we can get, we do get from the local community, and 62 cents from every dollar spent operationally goes into the community, and most of that at household level. The rest of the stuff like fuel, but at the moment through this model, which is only working through the employment of women, we're putting the same amount into that local community every 34 days as what trophy hunting was able to do per annum. So we have a viable economic alternative to trophy hunting that is working on the ground, but is only working with women. And this is currently the only nature preserve in the world that's completely managed and protected by women. One of the other things that we've observed is collection of information. Women have been fantastic at collecting information in their local communities. 3% of crimes that are solved around the world are solved by catching someone in the act. The other 97% are solved through intelligence-led operations, and that requires information. So it's much easier for us to take a phone call from someone in the local community telling us where a problem is than it is to walk around a million acres looking for that problem. We're in the process of expanding this model to many of the areas across Zimbabwe, across Tanzania. We currently have 4 more reserves that we're in the process of negotiating. One of those reserves alone is 750,000 acres. These are massive tracts of wilderness areas that would otherwise be left alone. And what we've done with this program is we've taken conservation funding and turned it into the most effective form of community development, which is female empowerment. We re-looked at the way we did conservation. We put female empowerment at the centre of the model, giving us the greatest traction in community development, and conservation has become the byproduct. We're also spending about $0.25 per acre per annum on protecting these areas than what we were spending in Mozambique, because we don't need helicopters, we don't need aeroplanes, we don't need canine tracking units, we don't need bigger fences, and we don't need more guns. What we're having is conversations. We're having interaction with families, the families in the communities that these women have grown up in. Women have been getting their lives back together. They've been exposing themselves to some of the best education the country can offer, buying their own land, building their own houses, and also, most importantly for me, and what's been touching the most to see what they do with their money is getting their children back. In Shona culture, if you can't afford to look after your child, it's taken from you, and it's given to the parents of the father. Okay, so these women never had an opportunity to do something else. There's been no handouts in this program. They've made the most of every single opportunity they got, but they fought hard for it. And it's what I've noticed with these women. They're doing it for their families, they're doing it for their communities. It's not necessarily about themselves, or like me when I went to Iraq, it's not about themselves, it's about someone else, and it's about families. The entire program is vegan, completely plant-based. Now, I walked around the bush for 4 years, protecting one group of animals and coming home and cooking and eating another group of animals. And then getting up on stage and asking people to support our programs on the ground. And I knew I was a hypocrite. And what I was saying and believing and how I was acting were two different things. They're going in two completely separate ways. And it went through this period of violent internal opposition. I didn't want to know the truth. I didn't want to acknowledge it. And I think deep down we all do know the truth. And it's change is not the tough part. Change is not the tough part. Change is the easy part. It's the process that leads up to change. The acknowledgement, I think, is the tough part for people. So I'm not speaking here today from a nutritional standpoint. I respect it. It's just not something that has ever appealed to me in any great detail. It's always been about the animals and the ethics of animals, because we're killing 100 billion animals a year, at least, land-based animals. Now, I didn't want to be a part of that system. I didn't want to be a part of that system, and I didn't want to pay someone else to do it for me. Okay, people get involved with conservation generally because they love the environment, or they love animals, or a combination of the two. Okay, it makes sense that the conservation industry should be driving this plant-based, this vegan movement. It's captive, but they're two completely separate things. Some of the larger conservation organisations don't want to admit it because they know it's going to piss off a majority of their donor base. And I say that's crap. You know, we've lost a lot of funding as an organisation because I put my hand up and say, this is the way we are and this is the way we're going to behave. And, you know, people have walked away from giving us grants saying that we're too militant, or we're too radical because we don't want to kill something. And my response is there's two types of conservationists. There's vegans and there's those that don't like to take their work home. So when we started this program with the women, we spoke to them from a nutritional and ethical and an environmental standpoint. We said, look, if we start this program, we're going to remain vegan, okay, plant-based. What you do when you go home is completely up to you on the weekends, but when you're here, this is what we're serving, and this is why we're serving it. Now, a lot of them will say, you know, when we went home, we were eating meat on the weekends, but now the majority of them say they're going home and they're passing this message into their communities. We have a program called Back to Black Roots, which is focusing on the traditional plant sources from Africa, food sources from Africa, where we work first with the women, then with their families, then with their communities, and then creating ambassadors. But at the moment, you've got a plant-based or a vegan movement that started in this small community, and the name of this community, actually the name of this town, is called Nyamakati, which translates into the meat pot. And that's because all the animals from the hunting operations that had happened there over the previous century used to come back here to get slaughtered, and then the meat was just distributed. So this town known as the meat pot is now the base of a vegan grassroots movement in Africa. The program and the effectiveness is like nothing I've seen before. What we're learning from women, everything in the way that they conduct themselves, I've definitely become the student and seeing all the positive flow-ons from this program. One thing we've noticed, you can't plan on some of the things that are going to unfold as this program gets further and further along. But one of the things that we saw in looking at the records kept for the previous anti-poaching unit, which was all men, they were being harassed by elephants and buffaloes on a weekly basis, getting charged. And the biggest threat for rangers is not necessarily the poachers they're trying to stop. It's quite often the animals they're trying to protect. And the elephants, the buffalo and the lion often can't distinguish between poachers and rangers. So they get charged, they get aggressive because they're trying to protect themselves. Now, after about a year, we noticed with this program that we hadn't seen one incidence of the women being charged, one incidence of the women being revved, or any sort of aggressive behaviour from the animals to this all-female patrols. So we went and spoke with the local university. We said, what do you think this is? And the professor there, Victor Mposhi, is the head of the wildlife department. He spoke with his students, and the only thing we can think of at this stage until we quantify what we're observing, what's hunted animals for thousands of years? It's been mostly men. We found a study that had been done in Kenya where they took voice recordings from two different tribes, one that had historically hunted elephants and one that had not. And they drove those voice recordings into elephant herds, and when they played the aggressive one, the matriarchs herded up and got into a very defensive mode. And when they played the voice recordings from the other tribe that had not hunted them, they were very relaxed and very calm and kept going about their normal business, their normal routine. So if we can quantify this scientifically, it provides another tool for anti-poaching operations that are out there to say all female patrols are actually safer from a wildlife perspective than mixed or all male patrols. We're not trying to put men out of a job over there or undermine the hard work that's been done by all the male rangers that are out there. What we're trying to do is try and even up an industry that at the moment is completely one-sided. We're trying to provide an alternative economic income for areas that have previously been set aside for trophy hunting that would otherwise be left vacant, resulting in the death of all the animals that are in there and the degradation of that land, and not only that, but turn into a cattle grazing area. We're trying to provide a platform to uplift Zimbabwe, a platform where by 2025 we want to have 1,000 women employed, 1,000 women across the lower Zambezi Valley, protecting tens of millions of acres of wilderness that is home to billions and billions of animals, billions and billions of sentient beings. And while those women are coming through the programs, they are getting exposed to some of the best education and then penetrating networks in the country, from education to healthcare to politics to conservation, coming through with a mindset, an ethic of compassion and morale, where they can be leaders, not only in their households, leaders in their communities, leaders in their nation, helping turn around a country that has had a 37-year dictatorship, is now so economically oppressed that we do need change. We do need new leaders to be rising up through the ranks. And I think the answer lies largely in these rural areas. Ultimately, this is not the evolution of women to fulfill conservation's toughest roles. It's the evolution of our industry and the men in it to see something we should have seen a long time ago. I can't take back the past, and I'm not going to be trapped by it either. And in this circumstance, nothing makes me happier than to say that we've been wrong. The past 2 years have been a steep learning curve for us, operationally and ideologically. The women, they continue to display a certain toughness, a calm resilience that I'm yet to understand, and perhaps some things are best left unexplained. What I do know, though, after two decades of law enforcement, warfare and conflict resolution, it's working better than anything I've seen before. And I think women, given the opportunity, will change the face of conservation forever. Thank you. We're going to do some questions. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for stopping to listen. I want to do some questions so this becomes a two-way conversation. Who's got you? Yeah. How does the... So if I can hear the question right, how do the guys in the military perceive what I was doing? Yeah. So I actually love giving them shit because they like to say that, you know, we're these big tough guys and, you know, we're out here to protect and save the world. Well, that's fine, but why would you hurt something that can't protect itself? You know, us tough men are supposed to, you know, we think we're supposed to protect the weak, the vulnerable, the trusting, the exploitable. And I think animals sit at the top of that list. So I didn't want to be that person anymore. And, you know, I mean, why would you want to hurt something that can't defend itself? And I say this to them, you know, and they give me shit. Call me like a hippie or whatever, you know, bunny hugger, tree hugger. I say, try it for a month, see how you go. You know, and look, I'm not going to appeal to everybody with my message. But I'm going to be able to get through to someone, to some groups, some demographics, and definitely with the military side. I've had hundreds and hundrds of emails from ex-military people that say they've watched the TEDx talk, which has been seen, you know, through different platforms quite a few million times. And it's, you know, it's just this is just a war. It's just a conversation we've got to keep hitting from multiple angles. There's no right answer. We've got to keep hitting it from different angles. And, you know, I say to people that are involved in our movement, we sometimes feel frustrated because we feel like we're talking to a brick wall. I keep saying, have your conversations. Keep having your conversations and keep getting better at them, because it took me a decade to change. Okay? It took me a decade to change. And a conversation you have with someone today may feel to you like it's falling on deaf ears. But the truth is accumulative. Okay? And it may take the person you're speaking to a decade also to come to terms with what the truth is, but once the shutters come up, they never go down again. Okay, so keep having your conversations, keep getting better at them, and don't ever think that a word you say in favour of our movement and in supporting animals falls on deaf ears, because the truth adds up.
Hi, I'd like to give you some feedback, and I have a question. So, I heard you on the Rich Roll podcast.
Okay, cool.
So I sat down and I thought within 10 seconds, oh, I know who this is.
Okay.
So, have you thought about putting or setting up an internship for a shorter period of time, like for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, for people who would potentially travel to Zimbabwe and provide support?
We did have an internship at a program that we'd set up in another reserve on the other side of the country. We have since handed that program over, the actual reserve, and with that reserve, we turned the program off. We turned the program off for a while. What we're doing is focusing on rebuilding and revamping that program, so they're going to be working alongside the women in what is a very demilitarized model that we're doing, but one that has a predominantly community and female focus. So yes, and we've had people from all over the world come out and spend time with us over there in Africa. We've had teachers that have worked with our instructors, helping them to be better instructors. We've had paramedics doing refresher training. We've had graphic designers helping us build posters and learning material for the rangers. So there is a place for everyone, just not at the moment. And it's something that if you watch this space, by early next year, that program will be started again. Thank you very much.
Hi. I was just wondering, how are the women in the community now being treated? Is it different between where they're working and when they're at home? Have you heard
They're
about
rocking
that?
the house. There's been this amazing social engineering that's been going on, where in the beginning, a lot of the men didn't like what they were doing. Some of them still don't. But after 100 arrests, they respect it. Okay, then these women, they drive through the communities, they've got all their uniforms on, they've got all their tactical gear, and they're getting chased by young children, like squealing and cheering for them. And they're doing one of the toughest and most respected jobs, and they're kicking ass at it. They really are, they're kicking ass. I mean, the national park next door to us, which is much larger and has a much larger force, they made 2 arrests last year. These women made 87. Okay, they've been featured It's the cover story for National Geographic magazine coming up. They've been featured on BBC World News, on 60 Minutes. There is a reason that people are sitting up and taking notice to this, because it is shifting the mindsets of what is possible in these rural areas. And what excites me is looking at all the communities now and how we don't have an anti-poaching unit anymore. We have a community that believes in what we're doing. Now, if we went into a small landlocked country in southern Africa, where our industry of conservation historically and increasingly had this antagonistic relationship with the local communities, on a continent that's going to have 2 billion people by 2040, on a continent that's had a 700% increase in armed conflict in the last decade, if we went into that environment and the only thing we did was we changed men for women and completely de-escalated everything, brought conservation and communities together and found a more effective and efficient way to do our business, and what's possible beyond conservation, and what's possible beyond Zimbabwe.
Have you been able to eliminate the approach that had been taken, I believe, for taking the ivory tusks off elephants so they wouldn't be such targets? Or is that still being employed in some areas?
So that you can't take the tusks off elephants to avoid it. You can do it off rhino. Now the thing is, there's about 400,000 elephants that are left. So to be able to go and take the tusks off all of them it's not enough resources or time, and they actually, those tusks are pretty handy. They use them for defence, for gardening, for eating, for digging up food, for protection. Now with the rhinos, there is a system there where they dehorn the rhinos and it acts as a deterrent. But again, it can't be used in massive populations because there's just not enough resources to do, and the stuff's continuously growing back. It's another tool in the box for smaller populations. I don't think it's the answer. I think it's something that can help us be, that band-aid solution while we're working on larger, more holistic solutions. What I think the solutions lie in the communities and building these communities up, getting them to a point where they either don't want to poach or they're willing to help us so much that poachers don't want to come through there because they know they're going to be caught. There's one thing I've learned with this program: goodwill is a currency. Goodwill is a currency. We can't put money into every single household in these communities, but what we can do is show them we're not out there to have a war with them. We're out there to have a relationship with them, a long-term relationship where our primary interest is uplifting those communities. If you focus on that, conservation just happens. I'm getting axed. I'm getting cut off. What did I say, Glenn? I didn't even swear. I'm an Australian. I spoke for 45 minutes. I didn't swear once.
Please give a warm welcome to Damien Mander.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your power in our movement. Thank you for everything you do for animals. So it means a lot. It's a privilege to be here and feel the energy from you. So thank you.
So has anybody heard of the Game Changers film? So Damien has a starring role in the Game Changers film that's targeted to be out now in mid-September. It's showing internationally now in China and getting a huge reception there. So we're very excited to be bringing that to hopefully the U.S. in September. So yeah, movie star.